Hi, good
Hi.
evening. Thank you so much, everyone. Good evening. My name is Nell Pepper, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am thrilled to introduce this virtual event with Atticus Lish presenting his new novel, The War for Gloria, in conversation with Duncan White. Thank you so much for joining us virtually tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and to our new and current digital community. Every week, we host events here on our Zoom account. Upcoming virtual events include Kat Chow in conversation with Brian Washington, Ruth Ozeki in conversation with Madeline Miller, and Cullum Tobin. Please check out the event schedule on our website at harvard.com. And while you're there, you can sign up for our email newsletter for more updates and browse our bookshelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button on your screen and we'll get through as many as time allows. This event will have closed captioning available depending on the version of Zoom that you're using. You may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase copies of The War for Gloria on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and of our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore in Harvard Square. We all thank you so much for showing up and tuning in, both in support of our authors and of the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. Lastly, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings over the past year and change, technical issues may arise. We of course hope that they don't, but if they do, we will do our best to resolve them quickly. Thank you so much for your patience and understanding. And now I am very pleased to introduce our speakers. Atticus Lish is the author of Preparation for the Next Life, which won the 2015 PEN Faulkner Award for Fiction and the 2016 Grand Prix Littérature Américaine. Duncan White is a journalist and academic who combines his position as Assistant Director of Studies in History and Literature at Harvard University with his role as lead book reviewer for the Daily Telegraph. He is the author of Vladimir Nabokov, Late Modernism, the Cold War, and the Literary Marketplace, and Cold Warriors, Writers Who Waged the Literary Cold War. Tonight, they'll be discussing Atticus Lish's new novel, The War for Gloria. Gloria is Corey's mother, and she's raising him on her own in Quincy. When Corey is 15, Gloria is diagnosed with ALS. Corey tends to Gloria throughout her steep decline, and he fights in mixed martial arts matches in an effort to pay for her care. Into this precarious situation enters Leonard, a charismatic and cruel autodidact who is Corey's estranged father, and Adrian, a troubled loner who first befriends Corey before he is pulled into Leonard's malevolent vortex. Dwight Garner observed in his New York Times review of The War for Gloria, Lish's novel is powerful, intelligent, brooding, and most of all, convincing. It earns its emotions. I am honored to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, Atticus and Duncan.
I just want to say thank you for that terrific introduction. I don't know if that went through, but I did want to say.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nell. We really appreciate it. And I think, Atticus, you're going to start us off with giving a little bit of a reading from the new novel, which is, which I read last week and thought just magnificent and so much on every page. So I'll be interested to see which passage you're going to select.
Well, thank you very much. And I will, and it's good to be here with you, Duncan. Thank you. So here we go. I'm going to start to read from the first chapter of this book, Woman, Earth, Sun, and Richard Feynman. You never think about nerves in breathing. You take breathing for granted. You take the nerves under your skin or under the skin of another animal for granted. His mother loved him. Gloria said, "You make me laugh." He had a sense of humor about their lives, apparently. She was a single mother, and he helped her collect her library off the streets of Boston and never complained about it. They went through crates of books together and shared what they found. Her boy was never bored, even living in her car. She came from Springfield, which she called her shitty little city. She had come to Boston to go to college. She wanted to stand on the shoulders of Germaine Greer, the author of Sex and Destiny. She gave birth to Corey at Mass General during what should have been her final year of college. She crashed in Cleveland Circle, Jamaica Plain, Mission Hill, just her and her son and her ever-changing roommates. For a time, they stayed at a triple-decker house in Dorchester, and he went to a school where a good half the other kids were from the Cape Verde Islands. Corey showed his mom the islands on the map, Boa Vista and Santiago off the coast of Senegal, telling her that he'd be sailing here someday when he grew up and went to sea. He had learned about the concept of a vessel from living in his mother's car. He had fastened on the concept early. Maybe it was always in his head, one of the basic concepts he was born with: woman, earth, sun, boat. Her full name was Gloria Goltz. In his mind, she was always a bright blonde. He saw her as having a glass jaw that she kept putting up, and it kept getting cracked. But when it came to him, she was stalwart. Once, she took him to a KFC, and the manager didn't want to give her another biscuit with her order, but she demanded it because Corey loved biscuits. He had read that sailors ate hardtack and salt pork, and the manager, with his thin arms and striped shirt, relented. "Mom, you're always giving me things. You never ask for anything." Gloria and Corey cut the biscuits on their brown plastic tray and had them with butter and honey. "Will you mind it when I become a sailor?" "Oh no, but I want you to be a smart sailor. I don't want you to be dumb." "But will you mind it when I have to leave home?" "I'll have to accept it. I'll come back and visit. Voyages usually take about 3 years. Whaling voyages can take 7. There was a pattern between them of her getting blue and of him helping her. She got blue because of herself. She had not fulfilled the ambition she'd had at 17, smoking a cigarette in front of her concrete dorm building at Lesley College, in the shadow of Harvard, in the literal shadow of its tombstone-shaped, ivory-covered law library, to think and write and shock the world, to condemn it, to synthesize all the available evidence, art, history, movies, negative images and messages in the media, her upbringing, her body in the mirror, her own thoughts, even the smallest things, down to the cigarette in her mouth, into a single scream of rage against the patriarchy. Instead, she'd been a waitress, a barmaid taking bottles off a counter after the bar was closed and the band was unplugging its amps and it was too late to do anything but sleep the next day away. And this had gone on for years, years of telling herself that she was finding her voice, that she was getting ready, years of reading, not writing, of groggy afternoons, a feminist book in her hands on the tea, Sex and Destiny, Doc Martens on her feet, reading at the Aubon Pan, jumping up from her wire chair and standing on the red leather toes of her boots to hug the street musicians who drifted in with the pigeons, carrying guitars, wearing bowler hats and German army trench coats, the wet stink of the bathroom around the corner, and the weird men playing chess all day, the hobos from Seattle, skinheads in suspenders saluting in the street, a dyed mohawk the size of a circular saw blade from a lumber mill atop a gaunt, bald head, kids from the wealthy towns of Concord and Lexington exploring new identities as bitter waifs. At night, a wolf pack of multiracial youths from Dorchester, one a white boy wearing a shirt saying "that funky Cypress Hill shit, there to sell drugs." Her skinny legs. She had dropped out of school. She had hung out in the pit at Harvard Square, sitting cross-legged in striped tights on the granite wall, her eyes mascaraed, her mouth painted black, debating with her fellow anarchists, giving the finger to the square, the bank, the bricks, the coop, the clock, the privilege and hypocrisy. The scream of rage was at herself. So sometimes as the years passed, she'd look at herself and the weight of the time and the evidence of who she was would hit her. And she'd get high and ask, will it ever be okay? And for some reason, her son would tell her, hey, Mom, don't be sad. You're great. You're greater than you know.
Well, fantastic. Thank you, Atticus. And I guess, I mean, that immediately jumps out is that, of course, this is a novel of Boston, of Massachusetts. And, you know, your first novel, Preparation for the Next Life, was so sort of embedded in New York and in Queens especially. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about your own history with Boston and with Massachusetts, and you know, why you chose to set this novel here, and sort of, you know, I mean, some of the sort of the detail that comes out, even in just that passage there, of the kind of the knowledge of specific periods, you know, is fascinating. So yeah, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Well, yes, I began coming up to Massachusetts for prep school when I was 14 years old. I went to Phillips Academy in 1985, and thereafter went to college. And I went to Harvard, and the scene that I'm recounting really comes from what I saw my freshman year, because I would leave my dorm and I would walk down to the square, and I figured out that area where the T is called the Pit. And, you know, I know it's changed a lot. It's changed a lot since the 2000s, but I'm pretty certain there's still a news kiosk there. There is, isn't there? Oh, have they taken that?
Like the kiosk is, yeah, that's another. I mean, Obon Pan's gone, and now apparently the kiosk is going as well, or it's gone already. So yeah.
Huh. Well, yeah. There has been a lot of change to that area, but well, yeah, there really has. So anyway, but it had a well, I mean, I just tried to capture the flavor of it from back then, which made a big impression on me. You know, it's so different from New York, where I grew up. You know, I grew up on the Upper East Side, and the thing about the Upper East Side, it's like a big canyon in the nice area. The nice area is actually desolate because in those days especially, you were hidden away, if you were wealthy, inside of a tower. And then you'd come out on the streets, and they were sort of a little underpopulated feeling. And there was, you know, we're talking the late 70s, the early 80s. I was aware that you know, you had to be cautious. There was a sense that you might have to defend yourself, or you might be the target of marauders. So one of my favorite movies eventually became Escape from New York. Anyway, so the difference with Boston was very stark. You know, I got to Cambridge, and everybody was packed in together, and it seemed superficially quaint at first, but I became very intrigued by the fact that if there was a bit of an underbelly, it was to be found right there in a form that I'd never really seen before. You know, the look of it, you know, the skate punk look, I'd never seen that. I don't recall. I mean, I'd seen it in the movies, but not in my own life. And that was a big feature of the square. To this day, I'm certain that there's a sort of a transient population that camps out around the Pit. There certainly was back then, and it had its own society. You know, eventually I ended up meeting the people who hung out in that square, and who hung out at Obon Pan, and sort of lived sort of on the streets. And yet they'd have connections to people who went to the colleges nearby, whether it was, you know, because there's so many colleges. And so there was this, so it was just a kind of a crossroads that could be very surprising. So, yeah, without letting me ramble further, that was the germ of that picture that I ended up trying to paint.
And so, you know, you obviously published your first novel, and you know, you said in previous interviews you were surprised by the reception and how well it was received. But then obviously you're living in New York by this time, so you were presumably you know, over the process of, I mean, how long were you working on The War for Gloria?
I started, let's say, early 2015. So the whole shebang I would say really took me 6.5, 7 years.
Oh, okay. And so did you come back to Boston during that period? Did you come back to the area to, like, you know, dig up some of this forensic detail?
Yes, I did. So I began working on the book. As you say, I was living in Brooklyn. I was living in the Sunset Park region of Brooklyn. And I would, once I committed to the subject, I began taking the bus up to Boston. There's lots of buses that run from New York to Boston. As you know, I see you smiling. So
Yeah.
you know about the Chinatown bus. I took that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And there's more and more traffic on the route between Boston and New York, which other people will know too. It's really getting crazy to get back and forth. And a trip that should take 4 or 5 hours, sometimes you'd be in a bus 6, 7, 8 hours. So made a lot of these trips up and down. And then I began, as early as 2015, I would rent an Airbnb for a couple of days. I stayed in Malden at an Airbnb. I stayed here, I stayed there. Then I began to get more serious, and I finally, by the summer of 2016, I rented a room in the North End, and which is I was going to say for those who don't know, but this is there's a local audience here, so people know the North End is the sort of Little Italy equivalent in Boston. So I rented a room up there and used that as a base of ops for studying the terrain. I would take the T down to Quincy. I would go up to East Boston because these are really the main areas that my characters were. I hung around Revere, East Boston, Chelsea. I had a roast beef sandwich with a 3-way, the horseradish sauce, the cheese sauce, and the barbecue sauce, if I've got that right, up on Revere Beach. So I saw the sandcastles on Revere Beach. I got my feet on the ground in Boston that way. And then finally, I'll wrap this up. Finally, the book just took me forever. And by 2020, July of 2020, I needed to do another rewrite. And at this point, I was really desperate to complete the book. And I had an old friend who really came through for me. His name is Paul Webster, and he's the owner of a moving company, a great Massachusetts moving company called Viking Moving. And I'm giving my thanks to them publicly. I want to thank Paul, and I want to thank his right-hand man, Taryn O'Leary. They're based now in Concord, Mass. They had me up there and let me stay in the warehouse and gave me a job and let me live there and write there until I did the final rewrite of the book, which I completed in November of 2020 before leaving Mass. So that was another time that I spent up there. Okay, long answer, concluded now.
Well, we can, and I want to talk about your jobs at some stage and some of the, the incredible things you've done in your life. But first, maybe a little more about the book itself, and as I'm sure those who have not had the pleasure of reading it yet understood from your reading of the first chapter, that the heart of this novel is this relationship between Gloria and her son Corey, and of course, the sort of the tragedy that hits them is ALS and her diagnosis with Lou Gehrig's disease. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about how you went about writing that? Because as you've spoken about previously, your mother suffered with ALS, and that this was something that you felt was a challenge for you to confront in your fiction. Is that fair to say? Well,
actually, I don't know if it was so much of. Well, I mean, everything was a challenge because I didn't know how to do it. You know what I mean? Like, but I I had such vivid memories of that period of time that some of it really wrote itself. I really very clear memories of certain of the challenges, the nature of caring for my mom and her situation. So, for example, feeding, positioning her. For those who may not know, ALS is a care-intensive illness. The patient gets to a point, unfortunately, although there are individual differences, of course, but in just taking my mom's case, she really couldn't do anything for herself. She reached a point where she was pretty, almost not entirely paralyzed, but could not really do much for herself. So she could move her arms and legs, but was very, very weak and had to spend most of her time in a wheelchair. So, for example, when you feed a patient, they can't support themselves, and the weight of their upper body will compress their stomach. So you actually have to tilt them back in the wheelchair, and but you can't tilt them too far back, or they'll have trouble swallowing. So all kinds of stuff like that were very familiar to me. Obviously it's a grim subject, and I don't mean to talk about it in any type of sort of offhand way, but since we're into it, all those things are very fresh in my mind still years later. So far from being a challenge, they kind of rolled off the tongue. In fact, if anything, I probably wanted to get them off my chest, and I used the book to work through those subjects.
And what is so brilliantly rendered is Corey's own struggles as his mother gets sicker to sort of establish himself in the world, to try and gain control in different parts of his life, even as he realizes there's only so much that he can do for his mother, and we see that, for example, again in something that I imagine you drew on your own experiences from, in the kind of the physical conditioning, in like him seeking to kind of control his body in order to try and maybe through that control the world in some sort of way. So, he gets into kind of mixed martial arts and into that kind of scene. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your own experiences and transmuting them, and the challenges of transmuting them into fiction.
Well, for the mixed martial arts stuff, that was actually fun to write about, and it was challenging, but less challenging than other parts of the book. Reason being was I could actually rely on, some of my own experience, but which is always very helpful, and also that experience tends to be vivid because you can really remember things that are painful. So that helped. I mean, all the times that somebody said, do another push-up, you can remember that. But also I could go up and I could watch real fighters. By the way, full disclosure, while we're talking about this, I just to keep it real, I got, people have to know, I only fought like half a time, basically. I mean, barely did anything in the sport. And, I did a lot of training compared to very little fighting. Not really, didn't have really a career in it. And lots and lots and lots of people fight. But it was very significant to me. It gave me a sense of meaning in life for a long, long time. So anyway, I wound up being a fight fan. So for the past 15 years, I've been watching the UFC. And when I was a kid, I watched Marvin Hagler. I mean, I like watching the fights. I like action movies. Anyway, so I'm a fight fan, and while writing this, I went to Albany, New York, to watch Cage Wars. I knew a buddy named Omawali, a guy I knew at a gym in New York, and he wanted to fight, and I went up to watch him fight in Albany. I actually got the what I describe as being the location of one of the fights in the book that I place in Springfield, Mass. I'm actually describing the armory that's in Albany, New York. So, so I did that. I went up to Rockingham Park and watched a good card of fights up there. I think we're calling it the Combat Zone. I don't know the name of the promotion offhand, but That was a great night of fights. And so I was able to kind of paint from life for that material. And so it came fairly readily compared to the other dark areas of the book where I really didn't know what I was doing. And I had to go by trial and error. And that can be an endless seeming and hopeless seeming process.
Yeah, could you maybe expand on that a bit, on the dark areas, and also the way that, you know, that kind of affected the process of writing the book, and maybe was the thing that you ultimately needed to resolve in those final stages in Concord?
Absolutely. I'm grateful for the things I don't know. Reason being, if I knew everything in advance, then the book would only be as good as my conscious mind. And that's limited, right? So, and I had to find that out the hard way. I'll tell you the truth. When I started to write this book, I think I was guilty of a certain type of hubris. I thought I would outline the book and I would know everything in advance. I had this dream of creating a logical structure. Now, I think what I found out the hard way is that I was putting the cart before the horse, and that if you want to write fiction, you don't get logic, you don't get coherence on the front end. What you first have to do, I believe, is to dive into the ocean and bring back, it's like you dive down into the darkness and you pull up something that you feel in the sand and you put it on the beach. You go back and you dive in again, you feel around in the dark, you drag up something else. One thing's a horseshoe crab, and other things might be an ingot of Spanish gold. You make a story out of those things. The logic comes after the fact. Maybe some of those things don't fit. You got to throw them back in the ocean. So for me, but as much as it's painful to not know what you're doing, I really believe that if I knew everything in advance, it wouldn't be very good, because how much do I know? The answer is not so much. So I began towards the end of this, especially when I got weary, I said, listen, the fact that you are going into the unknown and that you have to do trial and error, and that there are parts of this book that you don't know how to resolve, that's actually a gift in disguise. So learn from that. And
you mentioned the darkness of it, and obviously there's a lot in this book about the kind of, I don't know, the extremes to which young men are driven or drive themselves, and I wondered if you could talk about the different ways that these characters try and grapple with their masculinity. They seem to find sort of different outlets for it, and how that kind of tied into the, without wanting to give too much away, about the sort of the denouement of the plot, like how that kind of, I don't know, we could even call it toxic masculinity, is kind of the sinister undercurrent throughout.
Well, I mean, I guess with a guy, like Corey, just doesn't want to be, I mean, nobody wants to get picked on, you know what I mean? And that's what makes school shooters. So, what you really hope a school shooter doesn't do, or what you hope he did instead of being a school shooter, is turn around, face the bully, with a fist fight. Don't go get a gun, turn around and face the problem. You want to have a little bit of status. You want to get along with other people. You want people to not think you're easily picked on or that you're worthless. The whole world's not crazy. I don't know, Atticus, comb your hair, iron your shirt, get a job, clean your room, all that kind of stuff. And do your best to get along with people and be upright. I mean, all of those things would be things that I would tell my own son. And on the masculinity thing, I tell him, you tell you the truth, I would say it to my daughter too. I would say, try and be brave. Life is going to be challenging, and you got to be, I think fear has been, it's everybody's enemy. Winston Churchill said it right. It's certainly been true for me. I think it's true for athletes when they get frozen up before a performance. If we could all drop the fear, if we could remind ourselves the way the Buddha does, that, it all kind of doesn't matter. If you can play that mind game with yourself and flow, then you can be benevolent to other people. I mean, that's the dream. I think where Buddhism isn't sufficient is it's almost asking you not to compete too soon. I'm just going to opt out and be a mellow fellow. Well, it's hard to do that if the guy next to you starts making fun of you for not having nice sneakers or having money in your pocket or, doing well with girls or whatever it is. So what you actually have to do in real life, unless you're going to run off to a mountaintop, is, learn to play the game, learn to take a hit, learn to, all that stuff that I would tell a son.
And in another way that I thought the novel sort of offered a solution is through the discipline of work, right? And work well done. There's a lot of characters. It seems that in this novel there's a lot of respect and there's a lot of valorization for the characters that kind of do immerse themselves in doing the thing and doing it well and living by a certain kind of code around that. A lot of blue collar work. And you've obviously, I was reading previous interviews. You've worked everything from fast food, you've been in the Marines, you've worked as a security guard, you worked in factories, you've worked on a tugboat, if that's right. You've taught, you've translated, you've done a lot of different things. And, that shows in the book. Like it's a novel about many things, but there's a lot of labor involved and how you engage in labor and a lot of kind of felicity to the truth of people's work.
Well, I got to say, I think everybody around me seems like they're working really hard. That's my impression on the streets of America. Every day I see the UPS guys, I see, the trucks going by, unloading, delivering all the things that we don't want to go to the store to buy. Somebody stocking the shelves. I mean, I just see labor and industry. People are driving off to work. I see constantly. Everybody's working. And I think I'm particularly conscious of this because I don't have a standard job anymore. Sometimes I feel like a bit of a gold brick. I set my own schedule. I'm at home. I'm very aware that, I have a lazy side too. We can make it sound like I've, been some kind of hardworking fellow, but I really don't think I have been, because a lot of those jobs I did briefly. The real hardworking people are the ones who are still there. And, as you're saying that, I worked briefly at a horse farm. And when I say briefly, I was fired after 3 days because I didn't muck out stables fast enough. This was during foaling season. And I remember at the time sort of getting my feelings hurt that they weren't going to let me hang around. But I'm sympathetic to the lady who ran the horse farm because, of course, as you know, horses don't take a day off. The farmer never gets a day off. Those horses have to go to pasture every single day. They have to get fed every day. She hadn't taken a day off in a year. And I thought, okay, I get it. Let me get out of here. Hire somebody who knows how to muck out the stable so I don't waste your time. She still insisted on paying me. So I'm actually, and this isn't just working class. I think the whole thing around me, I have a sense of everybody doing their part and pushing. And really, I'm talking about during COVID too. I mean, scientists had to be running petri dish experiments again and again and keeping their eyeballs to those microscopes until they got a vaccine. And I have an image of that, by the way, because speaking of jobs, I used to work at Millennium Pharmaceutical as a bottle washer back in 1997. Millennium Pharmaceutical used to be down near Cambridgeport off the Memorial Drive. And that was a fun company to work for. And they would have these great barbecues from Red Bones Barbecue in Davis Square. So I know the locals listening will appreciate that. Okay, enough about me and work. I don't have a monopoly on being some kind of hard worker.
But, it is interesting, you do not have, I mean, it's a bit of a cliche maybe that there's a certain way of becoming a writer in the sort of contemporary American climate, with MFA programs and a kind of a sort of publishing machine that helps writers emerge. By no means does that not mean that they're incredibly talented. And I love a lot of writers who come through that sort of system, but you've obviously done it in a very different way. And yet, of course, you started out with a father who was very much part of, the literary world. Like, I have images of you running around Don DeLillo and Raymond Carver's ankles as a little kid. I don't know. Could you maybe talk about like what that was like having a father in the literary world, and then like coming back to that, later in life? It's striking.
Oh yeah. Well, first of all, when I met the literary world for the second time as an adult, it was completely different from what the very little bit that I picked up as a kid. I was quite insulated from it as a kid. But not completely. I mean, for one thing, my house was filled. My father's house, my parents' house was filled with books, and that I'm very grateful for. My dad would bring home a lot of books for me, and that was a great advantage. So, but for the literary world specifically, I didn't, you talk about me running around with Don DeLillo and Raymond Carver. The truth is, I do remember meeting Don DeLillo, but I was so young. It's a very vague memory. I went to his apartment with my parents. I couldn't tell you much about it. I have just an image of a dining room table. I know I was there. I have some, but it's almost like an image from a dream. I was very young. Raymond Carver, I have no memory of meeting. I know that I attended a softball game that my father was playing catcher at. Everyone was wearing Esquire jerseys from the Esquire magazine. Now, I'll tell you my basic sense of the change, of course, and you'll know this. Everybody probably knows this unless they're young. It was a man's world. Okay, that was my impression of publishing back then. It was, at least that's how I saw it. My dad was out drinking. It was guys wearing these tweed jackets. That was my memory of it. Tweed jackets, sometimes bow ties. And I didn't have the words for it back then, but I figured they were womanizing. I kind of got that picture. I always had a little bit of an unsettled feeling. I felt like it wasn't quite right that he was gone doing that. My mom was home with me. But you kids know stuff. Anyway, that was my impression of that world back then. Of course, it's radically different now. It's really what I think Steven Pinker is talking about in Better Angels of Our Nature. He says the world has been feminized. Maybe some of the world has. I certainly feel that publishing feels that way. It's extremely corporate, extremely genteel. I'm not complaining about that. I like nice people, but I take a look, my agent, my editor, I don't think outside of you at this moment, I'm not sure I know any other men in publishing.
Well, I mean, and in your novel, of course, like fathers, and the father is I mean, very well drawn, but is a sinister figure. And you obviously had your own issues with your own father that you've spoken about in the past. And
did that come across?
So I mean, how much of this was autobiographical? How much are you drawing on yourself, and then how do you then sort of pivot away from it, or how do you? I'm always fascinated by this question.
You say pivot away. I had to cut the umbilical cord. I feel like I painted the book out of things out of my own. Things that were close to me. I was going to use an organic metaphor, but we don't need it. So then at a certain point, I think the book had to go from being therapy for me to being a separate object, to being something that I could see objectively the way you would look at a sculpture or a painting, and something that I could design from a distance and make sure that it was beautiful and coherent, or attempt to do that. So definitely a psychological break, a giving birth, a parturition had to occur. Now that occurred fairly late in this process, I guess for obvious reasons. I think I think because of the subject matter, I was really close to this, and it just took me a while to get to the point where I could not feel like, for example, if people came along and said, well, we don't know about this paragraph here, you know, I would feel as if they were prodding me physically in a wound. And I couldn't hear it. I would flinch. I would say, how dare you? This belongs to me. That's a disadvantage. It was a great help to me when I got dispassionate enough to accept that maybe something wasn't working for the reader. And anyway, that stage didn't occur until fairly late in the process, probably until last year.
Well, I mean, and you know, it worked. I mean, it's a wonderful novel, and I encourage anybody listening along tonight to pick it up. Maybe we can open out now to some questions from the audience, and I will stop monopolizing things.
All right. Hi there. Yes, we do have some questions coming in from folks. Let me see. So the first one, an anonymous attendee asks, how was the experience writing this book different from your previous works?
Well, it was more painful. I had a hard, and I think it's because I wasn't painting from life. I was working from memory. I was working from psychology. So I would, the materials were different. I think it's a great advantage to be able to forget yourself and to just walk out on the street and paint what you see. I was able to do that with prep, and I was not with this one. So I think that's my answer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm curious about how did you approach writing about the fights? Were you writing for readers who don't know anything about MMA? Maybe I'm being presumptuous that, like, a lot of folks who are reading literary fiction probably don't know a lot about that world, but maybe that's just me. How did you approach writing about those? Yeah.
Well, you know, I think ideally,
looking at it,
I think ideally you don't worry too much about the audience. But on the other hand, you do have to communicate with people. And the funny thing about MMA is that it has taken a bit of time for it to break out into the wider world. You know, I became fascinated with it way before it was really popular. I was training in it in 1997, 8. I went out to California, trained with the Machados. It was exotic still to be doing grappling and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Now, I mean, it's been the next big thing for a while. But even during the course of writing this book, I mean, things happen so fast in the current age. It's like I'm always reminded of James Glick, who wrote the book Faster. I mean, things are getting faster and faster. And Don DeLillo, who we brought up earlier, it could be Cosmopolis. The idea that news gets so fast, eventually it becomes a prophecy. They begin to anticipate what happens. They tell you before things happen. But anyway, the pace of stuff is so fast that even a few years makes a difference. In 2016 or 17, I can't remember which, I showed this book to an editor, and some of the descriptions of the grappling went over the guy's head. And the funny thing is, he knew about boxing, so it wasn't as if he was completely outside of the domain of combat sports. But you know, when he sort of couldn't visualize what a butterfly sweep was in jiu-jitsu or something, you know, I'm sure that even now, just a few years later, there's a much wider general understanding because of the spreading popularity of the UFC and because of the crossover between mixed martial arts and boxing and the Conor McGregor phenomenon and Ronda Rousey and on and on and on. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Can I piggyback on that one as well? And just,
sure.
One of the things that I think is so, I don't know, like so effective in the way that you approach some of these subjects is that you don't necessarily compromise on the technical aspects of it. And that doesn't have to be with MMA. It can be with, like, how to dogleg an HVAC system, or how you But in Marston, there's like a kind of fascination with this stuff, which actually is kind of authentic and not necessarily like, there's a danger of that stuff being voyeuristic, right? Oh, look at how these people do this stuff from the outside, and you've not really earned the right to sort of talk about it. Does that ring true with you, the idea of needing to kind of like really try and understand something before you can kind of write about it?
Well, what struck me about what you just said was I had a terrific writing teacher at Harvard. Her name was Deborah Wilkes. She really got me started writing back in 2004. And she mentioned, I'm almost certain I don't know if she mentioned it in relation to Hemingway, but she said, you don't always have to explain things. The reader doesn't always have to know. So maybe it's just, if there's consistency, there's a lot you can survive as the reader not really knowing. Like I definitely see this when I read Hemingway on bullfighting. He'll use Spanish terms. I don't necessarily know what they mean, but I think there's a way of doing it. There's a way that he does it where I wind up not really being confused, or it has a coherent effect. I accept it anyway. I sort of get the point, even if I miss certain things. And and maybe a tiny bit of not knowing isn't so bad because it creates a little intrigue. And it's like, again, with Steven Pinker, I always mention him. Steven Pinker describes how certain landscapes appeal to the human eye. It's not a flat desert where you can see absolutely everything. It's the landscape that has a hill, and maybe there's a stream you can follow around the hill. Maybe there's something good. So we're sort of programmed to like the thing that we can see a little of, but there's a little behind it that we don't see. So when it comes to the descriptions of something technical, whether it's martial arts or bullfighting or what have you, I don't so much look at it from the standpoint of, have I earned the right to talk about it? I look at it from the standpoint of what's the effect on the reader? Are they going to be intrigued? And would I like to read this?
Great, thank you. Kind of a follow-up to that, we have a question from Judith Upjohn, who asks, essentially, in what ways did your upbringing and or at least this memory and sort of young childhood of this sort of, we're hearing about this kind of legendary literati kind of, and then going to Phillips, and did that kind of background affect or how did that affect your preferences for the people and the work and the activities that you were drawn to as an adult that, seems really kind of contrasted?
Yeah, I get what you're saying, and it's true. I think my life is in large part an example of backlash against something. I think that my parents, both of them, tended to value education. They were older when they had me. They were had rather highly defined taste in everything from furniture to literary style. I went through a period where I was in violent rebellion against all of that. I was like, get me out of here. I wanted popular culture. I wanted MTV. I wanted rock and roll. Now, most kids have that anyway, even if they come from a nice background. Not me. I was very tightly controlled, and popular culture was a mystery to me. When I came to it late, relatively speaking, and so it, something's a mystery. You want more of it. So anyway, but yes. Also, I have a problem I definitely had a problem with sort of snobism and class bias. I remember listen, if a guy comes to your home and he's going to do the wiring for your light switch, I didn't want to, I wanted to go over and talk to him. Whereas, I heard certain remarks from people that I grew up with that I didn't like. I for some reason, I took it personally, which is funny. It's like, what? I didn't identify with my class or who I was. I don't know. I took another side. Now, here's the funny thing: is I've gotten older and I've written this book out of my system. I don't really feel that drawn to taking a particular stance here anymore. I'm not, listen, I know I'm not, Scott Glenn's got a, Ed Harris has a great line in one of his movies. It may be State of Grace, but he goes, "What are you, the friend of the working man?" I know I'm not the friend of the working man. So I have done all the funny jobs that I've done, but I've just been passing through, and right.
No, that I mean makes all the sense in the world to me. This is more, I guess, something that I'm curious about the book and about setting it where you do, and sort of that there's Quincy and then your own education background. But I mean, do you, I get the impression, and maybe it's just because I grew up in Massachusetts and in sort of parts of Massachusetts that people don't, it's sort of central Mass, sort of on the way to Springfield, and people associate Massachusetts and Boston with, the Kennedys and Harvard and so on. But then there's this whole other sort of dirtbag part of Massachusetts that people don't think of. Is that, this is an odd way to ask the question, I suppose, but is that just me? Is that it seems like there is something about that schism that is particular and interesting to Boston, that a few writers, a few novels capture, and that this book captures. Am I making this up? Is this something that appealed to you when you were thinking about where to put the book?
I get your question. I mean, for me, I put the book where I did because it was kind of a nexus in time and in place for for the events that it was talking about. I mean, pretty much I was in Boston during a lot of the time that my mom's illness was going on. So, and it was that stage of life as well. So that's really the choice of the place. But for what you're talking about, the fact that Massachusetts has maybe a rural part as well. Like I drove out to Charleston one day to buy a mattress I got on Craigslist. So I was in that neck of the woods, so I'm intrigued. That's the thing. I'm interested in well, I mean, I don't want to make it sound like I invented curiosity, but I went through a period where I was very interested in the different parts of Massachusetts because I don't know, I just was because they were there, because it was unexplored territory. I suppose my reasons for being interested in East Boston, Revere, and Quincy, those date back to my college years, because when I should have been in class, I actually tended to go out and roam around the city.
It is weird to see sort of parts of everyday that really feel like parts of everyday life, not the sort of Harvard Yard version of Boston to which Nell was talking about, or Cambridge that Nell was talking about, but like, Route 2,
right.
which, now you've especially with the latter third of the book, you really creeped me out about parts of Route 2 now. So I'm gonna but yeah, no, it's and the granular detail about some of it, like you sort of sit up reading it being like, I know that Trader Joe's. Like, that's not something you necessarily always get in a literary novel, so it's fun.
We have an interesting question from another anonymous attendee who asks, there were a number of classic novels about the working class and the working poor from the 1930s, but do you have an opinion on which contemporary novelists speak to the experience of that part of the population?
I can think of two right off the top. Writers. First, the novelist would be Bud Smith. He's got a book coming out called Teenager. Bud Smith is a heavy construction worker from New Jersey that I have been in touch with since just this past month. Apparently, he was connected to my former publisher, Giancarlo Di Trapano, and so we had that in common. I had the chance to read his book, Teenager, in galley form. I blurbed it, proud to have done that. So he's definitely writing about that world. And so that would be someone to look for. The other writer I would mention, who I'm also in touch with and consider her a friend, is Tara Clancy. She wrote a memoir about growing up in Queens. It's not a novel, but it might as well be. It's The Clancys of Queens, and both are terrific reads.
Great, thank you so much. I think we'll about leave it there. I think we're about at time. Thank you so much to both of you, and thank you for this fascinating conversation. And thanks to all of you for joining us at home. Again, the link is in the chat if you want to learn more about the book and purchase copies. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore and all of us in Cambridge, Mass, thank you so much for joining us. Keep reading and stay safe. Thanks so much. Thanks again to both of you.
Thank you. And thank you, Duncan.
No, thanks, Atticus. Real pleasure.
Appreciate it.